Georgia and Metro Atlanta are booming economies with record growth in both jobs and population over the past 2 decades. Over the past 5 years, since 2017, the makeup and challenges of housing in the Atlanta region have changed dramatically. Made up of 29 counties, the Atlanta Metropolitan Statistical Area, or MSA, has grown 13% from 5.4 million residents to over 6.1 million. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, the median home price in the Atlanta MSA in August 2022 was just shy of $400,000, up more than 50% from $265,000 just 5 years ago. Compared to the growth in both population and home price, the total number of housing units, including single and multifamily housing, grew by only 6%, from 2.3 million in 2017 to 2.45 million last year. Housing is a fundamentally complicated challenge in a growing region like Atlanta. Zoning decisions are made by city and county officials in 29 counties and over 100 individual cities. Water and sewer lines, transportation networks, and electrical grids must be built to handle increased demand from new residents. Schools and hospitals must be built and staffed to accommodate growing populations. Law enforcement, fire protection, and emergency medical services must be equipped to service additional homes and businesses. As population growth continues, growth in our region's housing supply is not keeping pace. While new residents and new jobs continue to come to Georgia, there is no new land on which to build. Labor shortages, increasing cost of building materials, and the challenges of affordability continue to present challenges in the region's housing market. Leaders in state and local government, myriad nonprofit organizations, and private sector developers will be increasingly pressured to meet the dynamic housing needs of the Atlanta region in innovative and creative ways. We look forward to diving into these topics and hearing from our experts in the housing industry during this Campus to Community Forum. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, and welcome to the second of this year's Campus to Community Forums focused on housing. My name is Dr. Tyler Reinagel, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Economic Development here at Kennesaw State University. This series of forums gives us a chance to connect the research and teaching that are happening on campus with the reality that our students and faculty and staff face in the world outside of the campus boundaries. Today's housing forum will focus on the challenges and obstacles that we face in having a housing market sustainable for the Metro Atlanta region, and we're fortunate to have three great panelists with us today, bringing together KSU faculty as well as industry leaders and practitioners. To the far left over here is Dr. Chris Hess, Assistant Professor of Sociology in the Radau College of Humanities and Social Sciences here at KSU. Next to him is Will Johnson, Executive Director of Micro Life Institute. And next to him, Mr. Pete Waldrop, Executive Director of the Marietta Housing Authority right here in Cobb County. Now, as the forum goes on, this discussion will involve everyone in the room and all of you watching wherever you may be as well. If you have questions for any of our panelists over the course of the next hour, we encourage you to submit those via the YouTube chat, and we'll entertain as many of those as we can over the course of the next 60 minutes. So, with that, I'd like to kick off today's conversation by asking each of our panelists a look back kind of question, if you will. And as I was preparing for today's forum, I found a very interesting article from 10 years ago in the New York Times. It was an article entitled, "In Atlanta, Housing Woes Reflect the Nation's Pain." And it was talking about the housing industry as we were coming out of the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. And it painted a really bleak picture of what the housing market in Metro Atlanta looked like at the time. As we saw in the intro video, we're in a very different situation now when it comes to housing stock and the shortage. But just a few points that came out of that 2012 New York Times article. In November of 2011, home prices in Metro Atlanta were down nearly 12% from the previous year. It was the largest decline in any major metropolitan area in the U.S. The price of an entry-level home in Metro Atlanta had fallen by a third over the previous year to less than $100,000. And home prices had sunk below their 2000 level, which was a rarity in any Metro Atlanta, or any metro area. Excuse me. So the question I want to pose to the three of you is, in short, what happened? What happened over the last 10 years that got us from this very dire and very bleak situation of housing in Metro Atlanta to the shortage and the struggle and the cost obstacles that we have today? And we'll start down at the far end with Chris.
Sure. So I'm a recent arrival to the Atlanta area, but research like Dan Immergluck's recent book, Red Hot City, is informative about how there's two key factors that led to Atlanta having a particularly dismal fallout following the Great Recession and foreclosure crisis. One was that there was a lot of subprime lending activity here to a greater degree than many other markets. And then second, once the foreclosure crisis was rolling, the federal programs that would have helped with keeping folks in their homes were slow to roll out, and there were administrative barriers to actually receiving such assistance and preventing foreclosure. So together we saw this large stock of vacant homes sitting in neighborhoods for an extended period of time, which is pushing down the prices up until more recently. But you know, one important facet amidst this recovery was an increasing presence of institutional investors in this rental market here, and that is relevant to both the shortage and the unaffordability of rental housing in particular anymore. And so this was, you know, really buying up previously affordable properties and turning them into more expensive rentals that now have blocked out a lot of families from being able to access them.
Great, thanks for that. Will, how about your perspective from the nonprofit Microlife Institute?
Well, I think, well, we were just discussing before we started, you know, the 2008 recession killed a lot of the mom and pop builders. So, and you said a very key word, entry-level housing. That doesn't really exist anymore because if you look at the housing ladder and where we are with expenses now with housing, everyone has to go down a rung to access housing. So you have the really expensive housing, you know, people are buying those and they're a limited amount of that. And so every rung, everyone just keeps going down a rung, so they're buying up what has been built. So we don't have those builders keeping up with those entry-level homes, as well as we're also doing a great job getting people to come to Atlanta and the metro area. Like, we've got Yollywood, that is booming here. And so we're bringing a lot of people in, but we're not keeping up with demand. I mean, to reiterate what Chris said about what Red Hot City is bringing to highlight is, you know, we did a lot of that. Unfortunately, they had that issue with the subprime lending, which busted a lot of people's dream. But then also the builders weren't able to keep up demand because of financing and them going under. So it was unfortunately just a terrible situation that led us here.
Great, thanks. Pete, your perspective from the public sector.
Yeah, I would agree that one thing about Atlanta, Georgia metro area is for the last 40 years, it is always in the top 5 units built across the country. In fact, there's even been times when North Atlanta would be the number 2 market in all of the United States, and south of I-20 would be the number 3. There's a lot of activity, built a lot of homes. During that recessionary period, 2008, you had a tremendous amount of of apartments, multifamily units that converted to condos, were selling, and a lot of those with subprime rates getting and refinance through all those on the market. And so that caused a tremendous glut of availability of houses. The advent of investors coming into the Atlanta market buying up foreclosed properties. At one point in 2010, investors had bought vacant lots, 7,000 lots in metro Atlanta just sitting there developed. That dropped the prices, it attracted itself to national builders, tract builders, put the mom and pop guy out of business, and they came in and they built that model that was their houses, 5 houses, they're gonna build those, and that's what they're gonna have. And that caused a tremendous amount of pressure. From our standpoint, in the public housing sector, what was happening in the owner-occupied market did not affect us dramatically. Our waiting lists never changed. They're always extensive and long, but it was a perfect storm hit Atlanta.
Great insight from all three of you. And if we think about that shift from a housing surplus and kind of rock bottom prices, when we look at that less than $100,000 number for the entry-level home, we look now at the housing shortage, and we look at prices for housing that are beyond the reach of what many Metro Atlanta residents can afford. What can be done, and by whom, in the short term to start addressing this issue in a substantive way? And we'll start in the middle of this one with Will.
Well, we need to understand that we need to normalize other housing options, and that is through educating our communities and working with our local leaders about policy, housing policy. There are a lot of obstacles. Let's not say a lot of obstacles. There needs to be an understanding that we need to build community with our built environment. We think housing is nothing but single family housing right now. For some reason, that's what a lot of people, again, we were talking earlier, when people get their house, they're like, we're in, no more. No more building, no more developments around my house. I want my property to grow in value. So we've created this unfortunate cycle of expecting the homes to, jump in value, not letting anything else be built, but also being that not in my backyard attitude, and not allowing a community to flourish by reweaving that social fabric, allowing for walkability, allowing for connectivity within our different communities. Our car culture is so strong in Atlanta that we do need to think through third spaces, which is that local coffee center or that area that people can gather. We need to be approaching how we build a little bit differently, and we need to normalize those housing products. And I hate calling housing products, because what people need right now are homes. They need homes to help them flourish and help them be a part of their community. But the fact that they can't afford a home and they have to work so many jobs, and so they're not having time to invest in their family, time to invest in their community, time to invest in Metro Atlanta. And so how do we educate our communities to say we need to normalize better housing policy so we can build better housing products and normalize not just the single family home, but those community centers and areas that allow us to flourish and grow a diverse culture?
Great, thanks. Pete?
Yeah, exactly. It's education, education, education. Used to be, location, location, location. We've got to have a way to reach the community, get them involved, get their buy-in, because with the number of people that live in Metro Atlanta, and you talk about figures later on of what the population is going to be in the next 20 and 30 years, it's got to be a cooperative of all neighborhoods, all citizens working to understand that there's all kind of segments in the population that need housing. The work, live, place thing, live where you work and have the little community centers that he mentioned. Those are incredibly important to big metropolitan areas. Atlanta has been woefully slow to accept that concept. The NIMBYism is still incredibly harsh and hard, and until that is curtailed or calmed by having involvement, we're going to have a big challenge. I know in Cobb County, Chairman Cupid has formed a housing 2030 program that has brought all kind of people in from the community, not just elected people, not just professionals, but a wide assortment of people to try to talk through the situations before they get to the zoning fights and that type thing, because we're never going to have a successful housing program for everybody until we get cooperation from the community.
And you used the term there, NIMBYism, for those who may not be familiar with it.
Not in my backyard.
NIMBY.
Right.
Which there's also the YIMBY movement, yes in my backyard, which you all should be a part of.
That's right. Chris, your take.
Yeah, and I can just speak as a researcher. I think one of the most important things we can do in the academic community is to document just how prevalent housing problems are nationwide, as well as specifically in Atlanta, whether that's through documenting how homelessness continues to be an issue, or even just how a rising share of households, particularly renters, are spending 30–50% of their incomes towards rents. And I think that so mobilizing action for these problems starts with awareness and education, like they're saying. I think as a researcher, we can also try to shed light on which policies are efficacious, and this might require using novel data and methods like administrative records to be able to get traction on these questions. But ultimately, this kind of program evaluation can help us ensure that any policy interventions that we're making are informed by data and best practice. And then finally, I think that there's an importance to understanding both the direct and the downstream effects of housing, and this speaks to some of the community elements that we've already touched on. And so if we understand the effects of being housed and being in a healthy community that can be far-reaching in nature, we can then start to conceptualize solutions that close gaps in terms of just unmet need, particularly among folks who are extremely low income or low income.
Great. And Chris, I want to stay with you and preemptively beg forgiveness because I'm going to grossly oversimplify your research portfolio in saying that you do research in racial disparities, in poverty, in cost burden in housing. Obviously, it's an incredibly dynamic and complex area to study, but when you're teaching courses in housing, what are the 3 key takeaways you want your students to have at the end of the semester?
So I think it reflects my focus on housing inequalities first and foremost, but there's 3 key takeaways that I expect that all students should have. One is that the historical forms of discrimination in housing markets against households of color reverberate to this day, and that's especially true in the Atlanta area to the extent that growth and development can have disparate impacts and benefits to the community. Second, I think it's important that students are aware that there's a large gap in terms of the population that's eligible for assistance compared to those who are actually able to receive it. And this is purely due to funding for our housing assistance in the United States being on a fixed basis rather than tied to the population that's at need. And so this is most acute in larger, more costly metropolitan areas like Atlanta. And we really need to start from a perspective that shelter is essential, and this is particularly true for helping very low-income folks get their feet under them. And then finally, the last takeaway I'd point to is that tech is not necessarily a panacea for housing problems. And while it's important to making housing searches more readily available, on people's own time, that we're talking about long-standing inequalities in housing and neighborhood conditions that can interact with technologies in ways that create new forms of discrimination or closing out of particular people to housing opportunities. And so it's just important to not treat tech as being the silver bullet that can solve our problems.
Great, thanks. Pete, a question for you. I've been involved in state and local government in Georgia for almost 2 decades at this point, and I still get confused about local authorities like the Marietta Housing Authority. Right. Could you elaborate on what local authorities, in particular a housing authority, is in Georgia, and how you achieve your goals and the objectives of the organization?
Sure, Tyler. Just a real quick history. Housing authorities were funded by the federal government, Housing and Urban Development. However, they were created by the state of Georgia. 1938. So it's about an 80-year history of housing authorities in the state of Georgia. There's actually 185 housing authorities in Georgia. Some of them manage 8 units. Some manage 5,000. So I would say there's about 5 or 6 larger housing authorities, Marietta Housing Authority being one of them, that actively participate in building new housing for residents, whether it be family or seniors. But housing authorities, when created by the federal government, funded by the federal government, created by the state of Georgia, they were not seen to be permanent housing. They were a method for people to live for a period of time till their income advanced and their careers advanced and that type thing, and it would be temporary. That is not what has happened with public housing. It's become generational. We actually had a lady in the last year that passed away at 98 years old, and she'd lived in public housing for 87 years. That's not what it was set up for. It was set up to help people get started and get going. And the thing at Marietta Housing Authority, just quickly, we decided in 2006, we had 5 communities, 5 projects at that time that were built in the 1940s and 1950s. And they were not up to date to compete with, say, apartments that you see around this campus and around this area up here. So we demolished those. We relocated everybody out of the communities to housing, whether it be single family or apartments with vouchers. Section 8 is a common name, but it's a housing choice voucher program. Then we have since we're building our 15th and 16th senior developments right now. Our waiting list overwhelmingly was for seniors, people not in the workforce, people not advancing on, but people that need a nice place to live. And we now house 1,400 people in those 16 communities, plus the 4,000 vouchers we have.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Will, you run the Microlife Institute, which is a nonprofit organization focused on what you call missing middle housing, or the downsizing and right sizing of housing. For those who may not be familiar, can you elaborate a little bit on this Microlife concept and what exactly an organization like yours tries to do, and closer to home, where that fits into the Metro Atlanta housing obstacles that we face today?
Sure. So again, the institute is called Microlife Institute. I founded it about 9 years ago, and it's really the idea of utilization of space. So the idea of, like, how do we utilize the land that we already have, the land that our backyard, from our backyards to the strip malls, how do we actually look at land and utilize space better? So the Microlife Institute really educates, advocates, does research, pilot projects, and events all around educating and doing programming all around space utilization. So one of the things that we focus on is housing policy, just educating people what zoning is, what it means to the process to build an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard. And if those who don't know what that is that small cottage with a certain size, probably up to 750 square feet in your backyard, that allows you to do a couple things. You can have rental income, you can have intergenerational housing, or or you can move into it and rent out your big house. So again, it allows you to utilize your own land and space for the betterment of you and your family, or just you, or allows for housing options for people moving into the area. Again, maybe not living there all the time, but it gets them a foot into the door into the community. So the Microlife Institute, one of the biggest things is we work with local authorities. We work with governments to say, where are you now? Let's look at your comprehensive plan. Let's look at your zoning. Where do you want to go? And how do we find that policy in whether it be cottage courts, missing middle housing language, or other ordinances to allow for ordinances to be updated, zoning policies to be updated, so we can normalize more of those options for builders to add to the mix. Missing middle housing, if people don't know what that is basically after your single family home up to a mid-rise level apartment. So you're looking at duplexes, quadplexes, 12plexes, cottage courts, garden apartments. We built like this in the late 1800s up to the 1930s and 40s. But as soon as, after World War I and World War II ended, the suburban landscape quickly grew. And we defined, again, like I said earlier, housing is that quintessential, large, well, not large back then, but single family home. So we're not creating that density that allows us to drive up the value of land, which also helps pay taxes to the cities, which then also they can utilize that money to, better the land. So with us being spread out is actually weakening our cities and municipalities because of how much sprawl we do have. Because you think how much it costs to put a sewer pipe in for miles and miles, as well as repave roads. The taxes that most of us are paying are not keeping up with the infrastructure that we need to replace soon. So back to what we do, we actually built a pilot project. We had a city come to us, City of Clarkston. They asked us what could we do to add housing. We saw that they had a cottage court ordinance. We tweaked it a little and helped it take through their community or their council. They approved it, and then they asked us to build a pilot project. And I'm happy to say that it is a global award-winning, micro pocket neighborhood, 8 houses on 0.57 acres. I live there. We actually have a tour this weekend, so if people want to come visit, I've had 4,000 people come through my 500 square foot house. So I've hosted a lot, but the idea is Pete might come and say, you know what, this isn't for me. And I'm like, great, I'm glad you recognize that, but it's not for you. But I need you to see the value for others. I need you to see the value for other housing choices and other housing types for other people. And when you have that opportunity to see, feel, touch a real live example, it opens up the possibilities for better policy change.
Great, thanks. And I think at some point, all three of you now have mentioned governments in the plural, which leads into the next question, and discussing this as a regional challenge. Our friends at the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is the body that is the planning organization for 11 counties and more than 80 cities in the Metro Atlanta area, developed what they refer to as the Metro Atlanta Housing Strategy. And in this, looking forward to the housing obstacles in our region, they identified 6 core elements of conversations about housing in our communities: increasing supply, preserving affordable supply, reducing housing and transportation costs, expanding capital resources, promoting housing stability, and developing leadership and collaboration on affordability. So thinking about this as a regional challenge where governments and public organizations are going to have to work together with developers, with nonprofit organizations, what are some specific actions that you think could be taken to achieve these 6 core elements from the ARC's Metro Atlanta housing strategy? We'll start at the end with Chris.
Sure. So my sense is that we need to work hard to define affordability in ways that are actually inclusive of lower and extremely low income folks. Because when we start by negotiating things like constructions at 80% of the area median income, this already has priced out a number of households from being able to be included in such development. And so we need to make stronger commitments to affordable housing, whether that's at 60% of the area median income or lower, because the difference is in terms of hundreds of dollars per month, the little different scale, and that this housing shortage is really impacting lower income folks the most because of the sort of trade-offs that other households are able to make to stay housed, maybe at a different rung of this sort of housing ladder, so to speak. But that we should try to negotiate developments in ways that don't exclude the folks who are facing the pinch the most, but instead start by including them and then ensuring that any terms of incentives that we're offering to developers are on a long-term basis rather than as some sort of short-term 5-year or 10-year program. So that's where I would say to start, but I'm looking forward to hearing what others have to say too.
Great. I was going to say, if you're making hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, I need to look for a job in the sociology department.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's not the place to start for that.
Will?
To add on to what Chris just said, but also if you look at, right now HUD defines, affordable housing as 30% of your income should go to your housing costs. We need to tack on transportation to that. So right now, I don't know the exact numbers, and Pete, maybe you do, or Chris, maybe you do, but you add on the 30% of what you're supposed to spend on housing, and probably another 20 to 30% on driving transportation, because again, our car culture, we do not have the mass transit to support an affordable housing, to get to where you need to be to pay for your life. So basically the affordability of living is way above the expectation or the ability to afford a good life. So you have your 30% you're supposed to be spending on your housing, then add another 20 to 30% on gas, car wear and tear, just transportation, parking. You're looking at spending over half of your income on just your car and house. And transportation is huge. You can't talk just about housing and not go into all these other aspects. We already mentioned schools. We got to talk about transportation. We're talking about supporting the local government and cities. And so housing is a key, a solid foundation block. And we do need, with the ARC challenge, but it comes back to what we already talked about, education. A lot of people don't understand how fragile, our housing stock or the housing crisis is, and also just embracing the fact that they can diversify their community just a little bit, working with local, community groups. How could we add, 15 more units of housing in this block? Give them suggestions, help them come up with the ideas, and then bring them to the builders. It is going to take a team effort because there is a lot of obstacles. There's a lot of pushback. You looked at what happened in the city of Atlanta last year when they tried to redo their zoning. People came out with pitchforks. It was really bad, but unfortunately, the education wasn't there on the why.
Great. Pete?
Yeah. Well, I think, once again, the education, we use about 50% of your income in what we call our success program. It's called, the name of the program is Family Self-Sufficiency, where we take people that are our current tenants and we try to help them move forward to where they can be property owners. It's real estate, taking care of your property, taking care of your finances. And so we tell them to set aside 50%. If you can do that, we feel like you're going to be fairly successful in the Atlanta market today. But it's going to take at least that 50%. I think overwhelmingly one of the biggest things that's got to happen is there's got to be somewhat more of a uniform zoning across the area. Cobb County has done a pretty good job of this, working with the cities, where if there's a piece of property being such that you don't allow a developer to play a county off against a particular city or cities against cities. They have to have a uniform agreement to go forward with what that zoning is going to be. That would be a dramatic improvement in Metro Atlanta if you took the 11 or 15 counties, whatever you consider the Metro Atlanta. And I think ARC would be the first to say that'd be a huge step in that direction, is trying to come up with something that's where you can't negotiate against people.
Right.
Overwhelmingly, you've got to get mixed income housing projects, whether they be multifamily, single family, where you bring in all stratas of income, low, middle, high. And it'll work. It works in other places in the United States. It works some places in the metro area. But we got to do a better job of that. And the communities I mentioned that we had built and are building, we have all three income levels in there. Predominantly, it's the lower income, which is 30%, as you mentioned, 30% income. But then we have a 60% level, and then we have what we call market rate apartments. I think more and more projects like that, if you can direct and encourage your developers to do those, and give them some incentives. It's a little. I'll put on my old developer's hat now. It's a little hard to give a lot of incentives because all the governments have given away density. They gave it away 10 years ago.
Yep.
Used to be you had to fight to get a 1/3 acre lot, let alone a 1/5 acre or 1/4 acre or 0 lot lines, that type of thing. So that's gone. That's not going to be what makes the developers come to the table with affordable housing. So that's something they could help with the ARC with.
Fantastic, thanks. Just a reminder to everybody, both here in the room and watching, please be sure to submit your questions via the YouTube chat, and we'll take as many of those as we can as we continue through the hour. Now I want to turn to Chris, and a theme that's come out of this discussion, and really anytime we talk about housing, is complexity. And from an academic perspective, that means it's fundamentally interdisciplinary. Not only your work in sociology, but colleagues in political science and construction management and public policy. It's a very complex web. So from your perspective on the on-campus lens, what can we do to better equip students to better understand and respond to that complexity when they graduate, they become leaders in their community after graduation? What can we do to get them to really wrap their heads around that and be effective change agents moving forward?
I think there's a couple things, but I think one of the first things that we need to start by engaging students with the original research on housing issues as they're being studied right now, because there is no textbook for teaching students about the unaffordability crisis or the difficulties of being unsheltered. And so we need to start by having breadth across disciplines, like you're saying, because being able to research or lead an organization through some sort of problem targeting housing problems in our community requires knowing the body of knowledge, not just from any one discipline, but from housing's far-reaching implications for law, for finance, for health, and including the contributions from the social sciences. This interdisciplinary foundation it's crucial for informing where the open questions are and then where the unresolved problems are for students to then go out and be able to make a difference on. Second, I think that we need to also provide opportunities for students to apply and practice skills in their community, and whether this is through service learning opportunities or internships, this can be crucial for giving that hands-on real-world experience. And that, for example, in the spring I'll be teaching a housing course for the Department of Sociology, where we help out the Cherokee County Homeless Veterans Program through identifying where the unmet needs are of unsheltered veterans in their community and trying to create resources that help them connect those veterans to the supports they need. And so opportunities like this, importantly, can just show students what impact they themselves can have in the community, but this can also be informative for career decisions and even just being an engaged citizen. And so I think that those two areas that I've spoken to are really essential starting points.
Great, thanks. Will, a question that came in from the audience. The micro-home or micro-life movement is one that's gained a great deal of momentum in recent years, and our viewer mentioned HGTV in particular as a source of that. But we know just from this discussion in our daily lives and the work that we do that public policy and government bureaucracy is a lot slower to respond to something than pop culture is. So what have you experienced as the biggest challenge or obstacle in the public policy realm when it comes to the micro-life movement that you champion?
Just to kind of go off of what Chris was talking about with students, also I think students, getting that worldview, when you travel, when you visit other cities, take note, understand what you like and where you want to live, and ask, why can't I have that close to where I live now? So it's the idea of like what makes up the city and community that you want to live in, and understand and lean into understanding what zoning allows for that. I mean, Europe had the blessing of no cars for thousands of years, but also, as the United States, we're still a young culture, meaning we don't necessarily melt together. We don't really, understand that we want to reach out to our neighbors. So I guess it's the idea of culturally, we need to also embrace each other and being more of a community versus this is my land, this is your land, don't talk to me. Like, we build these structures to basically hide. We have our garage facing the front street, we pull in, and then we interact with our private backyard. So we have not built in a way that allows us to actually interact as humans. And we're also dealing with a loneliness crisis that from, seniors and boomers that are not knowing what to do with their 3,500 square foot spaces to, just people with, especially coming out of the pandemic, not knowing how to go out in the world and interact with each other. So just wanted to get that off my chest. And then for the micro movement, I will say the word, some might put me in the category of tiny houses, but tiny houses are, in the world of its own, another definition. So the state of Georgia, we helped bring the tiny house appendix to the state of Georgia in 2017, which defines a tiny house as 400 square feet or smaller on a foundation. If you see the Tiny House Nation on Netflix or HGTV, anything that's wheelbase model, that is considered a recreational vehicle, which is a whole nother zoning category and a whole nother fear that we're not going to get into today. But it is a phenomenon of people understanding we can live in smaller spaces. So the idea of what MicroLife Institute is doing, and please correct me if I'm not on point with what you were talking about, we are showing that we need better options, a variety of smaller homes and right-size homes in different spaces, because we as a culture don't really know how to interact with space, as well as good design space, what 500 square feet could actually be for you. And so where MicroLife is going with this whole, you could talk about minimalism with Marie Kondo. You can talk about, downsizing your way to happiness. There's a lot of people right now understanding they don't need that much stuff to be happy. And we still need to build products that allow people to still have their own little piece of the world, but they go out and exist in the community. So it's not saying, just kind of like I say, New Yorkers don't give you an address where they live. They say they live in New York. But Atlantans and we, in the South, we give our exact address of where we're going to be. And we can't necessarily walk out our front door and interact with our community. We're getting better at it, but we usually have to get in a car and go to our location. Did that even answer your question? I'm sorry, I kind of went on
it did. It's a broader policy discussion, so that was fantastic. Thanks, Will. Pete, a question for you from your kind of boots on the ground perspective. You know what's going on in Cobb County. You've been a part of the Marietta Housing Authority for some time. What do you see as the biggest misconceptions about the housing challenges facing Cobb County and Metro Atlanta? And more importantly, I think, what do you think we can do collectively to overcome those misconceptions?
Yeah, I think that because we go through zoning as well, we're not exempt from zoning. When we have one of these communities come up, it's going to always be trying to let your neighbors know what you're going to do, that you're not coming to build a 1940s brick project next to their nice subdivisions. So it's reaching out, educating them, being a friend. We spend a lot of time when we put in one of these communities in the community, going and talking ahead of time and showing them what we've done before and trying to actually get them to be a supporter and a champion. And it actually has worked. We've had them come out who opposed us in the beginning, and we build the second or third one, they come and speak for us on the behalf. So that's a big challenge, to get everybody on board with the buy-in. That's an old building developer phrase, but you got to get them committed, or they're going to make you probably will get the project approved eventually, but it sure is nicer to go in when you got the surrounding community supporting you and seeing the good that can be accomplished. And we were talking earlier, we'll build these communities, and they range from like 80 units to 160, different sizes. And we rent those things up within 60 days, which is about 10 months ahead of, because there'll be a waiting list of 400 people to get in those communities, seniors, 62 and over. And I mean, we got to do it, whether it's Marietta Housing Authority doing it or a community of the micro light. We've got to do it because Atlanta is an aging like the country.
Yep.
There's a bunch of my people out there, and by the way, don't worry about me. I got a puppy to keep me going now.
Good.
But we got a lot of folks we got to take care of, and there's somebody's mom, dad, they're hopefully not going to go away for a while. So we got to get that buy-in and try to make it work as pleasingly as possible for the whole landscape. It can't be my single-family half-acre lot standing on its own.
Great, thanks. A great question from the audience for all three of you, and Pete, we'll start with you on this one. How can students who have bought into community development encourage the greater community in areas like Cobb County to buy into the yes in my backyard or YIMBY mentality?
Absolutely. We actually use, we have interns that work for us that work through our development department, and they are our boots on the ground in a lot of situations on a upcoming zoning, which starts 6 months ahead of time sometimes. And we make them salesmen and get them convinced it's a good thing to take care of old people or people that need a place to live. And they work in the community. They start attending things like fall festivals, PTA meetings. We do it all, and we use interns a great deal to do that type thing.
That's great. Will, from your seat?
I would say the YIMBY Action Network that is in Atlanta, the group is called Abundant Housing ATL. Join it, because just like Pete alluded to, when you have to go through zoning, and again, back to education, educate yourself, but then also educate your parents, because they need to know this too. But Abundant ATL makes sure that they find community leaders within the area that a new development or a new project is coming, that the people who are supporting that project will show up. Because it's really easy, if you don't like something, you'll show up to it because you're opposed to it. But if you like it, you're like, oh, that's a good idea. Like, I don't need to show up. Yes, you do. You need to show up and say, this is a good idea. We need this. There is no silver bullet. I don't like it when people say there is a solution for housing. We can only do with what we can with the policy given to us. But the biggest thing is understand zoning, and if you can, be an advocate, just like Pete said, show up in understanding and support these initiatives that are in your local community.
Yeah, and I'll just add that renters, particularly low-income renters, deserve a voice within policy debates, and they are often underrepresented, to say the least. And so to the extent that direct action can come through participating in pro-tenant groups like the Housing Justice League, that can be a way for students to be directly involved with trying to do things like prevent evictions in their communities, or to ensure that there is affordable housing opportunities for the people who are maybe marginalized within their community particularly.
And there's a really good program. I'm forgetting it, and I will get you the information. But it also pairs seniors with students or younger generations. So you have a senior citizen or a boomer generation that has this great house, and they have like 3 or 4 bedrooms that aren't being utilized. And so it's just like you have to create a profile, you go through a background check, but it pairs younger generation with older generation. And I love reading those stories, because it's okay to have a diverse group of friends in different ages, different classes, different diverse backgrounds, minorities. Like the idea is, be a part of your community, but you don't have to live with your same age group. You don't have to interact with your same age group, but it's a really good group that, again, connects people for better housing options.
That's great, thanks. A theme that has come up throughout this conversation has been zoning. So I want to take a little time to get more in-depth on this and discuss what zoning looks like and the impact that it has. Zoning ordinances, of course, are adopted at the city and county level. So if we look at the metro Atlanta area, we've got over 100 different jurisdictions in the Atlanta MSA, each with their own zoning ordinances. And these determine what can be built, where it can be built, how dense it has to be, what requirements exist. Zoning ordinances are very important to this discussion. I think everyone here would agree with that. And recently we've seen some changes in zoning ordinances in different communities that have been very impactful. Down in Gainesville, Florida, I hear there's some school down there, I don't know.
Yeah.
But in Gainesville, Florida, the city council voted recently to eliminate single-family zoning. This was something that was known as exclusionary zoning citywide. Mentality like that is that single-family zoning is going to prevent higher density of housing construction, and it's a contributing factor to housing shortages that exist. On the other side of that same coin and closer to home in Brookhaven here in DeKalb County, right down the road from where we're sitting, the city adopted a mandatory inclusionary zoning ordinance, which required a requisite amount of workforce housing in any special use development areas. So to each of you, to what extent do you believe zoning reform is a part of the solution to the challenges we're facing in both availability and affordability? And I know, Pete, you talked about this as a regional question earlier, so I'll start it with you.
Sure. As I said earlier, I think a regional solution to zoning, that's the ultimate. That's the ultimate thing you want to get to. I think that cities and counties need to continue to be proactive in their 5-year plans that they put, the cities are in the state of Georgia required to put it together every 5 years, to put a zoning plan out there that you have a map to go by, something to work with. It kind of levels the playing field for the opposers as well as the people wanting to get things done. But I think the more they can get out in front of issues before they fester and become bad, that'd be a significant improvement. These 5-year plans do that because there's a lot of active groups that are getting involved, which is good, and they study what can go in a certain place and see what will happen. Doing away with zoning, I don't think that's a very good idea. We're sitting today 15 miles from a county that has just blown wide open in the last 15 years, Cherokee County. Cherokee County didn't have zoning until about 1995. You could have a trailer park, you could have a gas station, you could have a subdivision. That's no good. That's not what we want to solve the problem we got. So doing away with zoning, I'd say that's something, somebody's got to have a lot of watchful eyes on that. But I think the planning, get involved in your governments. I was telling Chris ahead of time, fortunately or unfortunately, I had the privilege of being a councilman in Marietta for 12 years. And I would see guys or people come forward that would fight a zoning, NIMBY. And it was amazing how during that 12 years, that same guy would come back in 5 years and he'd want something developed. He couldn't imagine how anybody turned down. So people's selfishness, we got to put that behind us to build a better housing situation.
And those comp plan processes, those are all public. There are public participation segments that go with that.
In fact, they seek the public
regardless
input.
of what city or what county you're in, that process is very much a public engagement effort.
Advertise in the paper when they're going to have them.
Will?
I would also say with those comp plans, they need to be executed. Unfortunately, they're just revised, and then nothing happens. Also the pendulum of, politicians, you vote in someone who says, let's change voting or change policy for housing, and then suddenly they're voted out the next cycle. So what is the administrative policy that allows people to follow so they can do stuff by right, so not to remove the total obstacles of NIMBYism or people showing up opposing. I'm not saying just carte blanche, allow people to build, but I think the cities need to realize, yes, they have a planning and zoning department, but they also need to understand, and I know they talk about, a lot of cities are looking at, and you see the success in like Duluth and others, creating their downtowns. How do we create that walkable, connected community that a lot of our Georgia cities don't necessarily have, unless they were much older? So how do we help with develop that policy with the comprehensive plan? But then I think also we do need some administrative by right policy to normalize some of the other options. Again, allowing for the 11 county makeup to just say we can do this. I think it would be just like the state of California. They did accessory dwelling units by right, the entire state, and it had to go through state. That they just said you can't say no. It's got to happen. I hope it doesn't come to that for Georgia, but I think for our metro area, we do need a more unified policy to allow people to build smarter, utilize their space, and just be more inventive with housing.
Okay. Chris?
I'll agree with what Pete was saying about zoning reform being one area that we should definitely look to make some progress. But like what he was saying about it being needing to be at a regional level, if we have only uneven adoption across cities and counties in the area, then we ultimately stymie any sort of impact that this policy can have. And especially if the sort of commitments to affordability or inclusion are watered down through the process, then we end up with defining affordability in such a way that working class folks are still excluded, and certainly low income or extremely low income people would be as well. And so we need to try to be inclusive of people whose affordability is lower, and that this comes back to defining it in ways that ensure that we have low, middle, and market rate affordability present in the neighborhood.
That's great. Thanks, all three of you. Another question from the audience, a great one, and Chris, we'll start with you on this one. With the legacy of redlining in cities that have been bifurcated by highways and marginalized communities most often being cut off from basic services such as decent food, health services, and jobs, how can new housing options and the development of affordable housing take a holistic approach to overcome the legacy of housing policies and the physical structures that still isolate communities?
Sure. So with the Beltline and other large-scale projects in the area, there is evidence that we need to engage with the existing residents of the communities that are most impacted, and that having conversations with the households of colors who stand to be impacted by displacing forces and gentrification, that's really only, it's part of the solution, but it's a way to ensure that there's input throughout the process, and that maybe through tying in affordable housing through these developments that we can, keep some of the existing tenants in place. But it's a multifaceted problem, and so it takes multiple solutions to try and move the needle on it.
Great. Pete, we'll jump over and then come back to Will.
Yeah, that's a tough, gentrification's a tough thing to deal with. I think in our county, in cities right now, we're not really having a terrible problem with that, but it could be like downtown Atlanta, certainly with all the infrastructure that goes along. But you got the inclusiveness again has got to be thought through on any of the plans. Years and years ago, planned unit developments was the big thing that all developers strive to do, where they could bring in economic as well as housing and workplace and that type thing. And that's kind of gone the way of a bad dream, but it's coming back, and it needs to come back in different approaches where you can be inclusive and try to bring all of the work, live situation to your communities. And I'd like to see a lot more of that in Cobb County right now.
Great.
It's lagging though.
Will?
Well, you look at some of the projects that are formulating right now. I don't know if you've heard of the Stitch. So that's connecting Midtown to downtown Atlanta, covering 85, 75, and allowing, to unify it again, to allow more of the energy to flow downtown and stuff like that. And then also, just kind of pulling in the religion and faith-based community, where there's a lot more religion and real estate going on. So how do we bring in a lot of local religious institutions who have the land in areas that are potentially perfect to add more housing to it? To the Beltline, whoever mentioned the Beltline and also the gentrification, it's unfair that these communities are getting this much attention, because unfortunately with the redlining, the property value is lower. And so now the land is cheaper, and so the developers are focused on that land. You have Microsoft coming in. You have all these major companies. You look at the Quarry Park that just opened up in Atlanta. So this huge imbalance has happened, and I want to say, how can we share the wealth or share the ability to add density? Because it shouldn't just be in these neighborhoods that are being gentrified. We should look at other neighborhoods that already exist, that are in our wealthier areas, that are in our are ones that probably put up the most fight, to say, how can we add more better density to those areas as well, instead of just these legacy resident communities that unfortunately because of redlining and our policy up until now, are the more attainable prices for the larger developers to execute on.
Great, thanks. We're quickly approaching the top of the hour, so I want to wrap up by looking to the future, looking at where Metro Atlanta goes from here. And the intro video that we had at the top of the hour talked a little bit about growth that we've had in recent years, but the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget population projections for the Atlanta MSA have us eclipsing 6.8 million residents by the end of this decade, and by 2060 up to 8.6 million residents. So a two-part question. We'll do the first part and then we'll reverse and go down the second part. First part, starting with Pete, what immediate stopgap actions need to take place to address this short-term growth, the new 500,000 residents that we're going to have by the end of this decade?
First and foremost, you need to identify, to the best of your knowledge, who those 500,000 people are going to be. Are they going to be lower, predominantly lower, medium, or higher income? And so that gives you an idea of what you develop your plan toward. And I think you are going to not exempt any of those three income levels of people. Everybody's going to be involved, and you're going to need, but you need to know what to do to go forward. You need to know, back in our area, the aging. Is it going to continue to age out like it's projected it will? Because if it is, then people like Marietta Housing or the Catholic Church or the Mercy Hospital Group, that's a big apartment developer across this country, they need to be in here with us building more seniors. If it's going to slow down a little bit, then you need to figure out what price level you're going to build at. You know, one of the biggest questions that I would ask everybody in here to define, what is affordability? Affordability is a moving target. The two things in housing is affordability and foresight architect. Everybody wants the houses to all be four-sided architecture. Nobody can define those. Nobody. Architects can't define it. So affordability is something we can't get our arms around. We got to continue to work on it to try to do it.
Great. Will, short-term stopgaps?
Honestly, I would say allow for accessory dwelling units to be allowed to be built in the backyards. That would add density and the ability for starter homes, you know, and just more places to live, you know, very quickly.
Yeah,
Chris?
More advocacy on the part of renters and more organization to try and do things that are pro-tenants are where I would start. It's easier for middle and upper income folks, particularly those who are moving to the area, to make housing consumption changes that allow them to stay sheltered. But the pinch related to more and more people moving to the area and the shortage getting even worse will continue to be felt by people who are at the bottom of the income distribution the most. And so while that does mean putting some emphasis on, you know, the folks who are here already as part of, you know, who we're trying to accommodate with shelter, I think that that's important to the extent that people who are moving to the area do tend to be people moving for economic opportunities. And so to the extent that they're coming in at a higher rung on the income ladder, it's probably less acute, you know, what the sort of affordability crisis means to them compared to households who are already in our community.
Great. And the second part to this question, and to wrap up our conversation today, and Chris, we'll start with you on this one. What systemic actions can we take for long-term solutions with more than 2 million new residents anticipated over the next 4 decades?
So I think that things like the zoning reforms that we've talked about would be great. I think that the affordability problems that are here, though, are not dissimilar to what's in other contexts across the United States, though. And so to the extent that we have this unmet gap just in terms of the low-income population, in terms of being able to provide them with assistance, that seems like a natural place to start. That if we were able to make it so that 4 out of 4 households in need are able to get a voucher rather than just one, that would mean a lot of progress in keeping people in stable housing and also helping them keep the lights on and not be burdened by their housing costs either.
Will?
I would say let's build up and pull in and not keep sprawl going. So how do we create those walkable city centers? You look at these, all of these dying malls, strip malls, areas that just need housing. We need to hit the reset button, work with developers, work with the community, and really create that walkable density that allows us to flourish as a community.
And last but not least, Pete.
Yeah, certainly keep working with the citizenry, keep educating, keep talking, get more uniform zoning activity. And I would say personally, the last thing we need is more municipalities. creating new cities, which we went through in this last election, still one going on now from Mableton. Those are all bred from zoning disagreements with what happened in Cobb County. We don't need more cities. We need to tighten up what we got and make it more uniform.
Great. Well, thanks to all three of you for being here today. Two things before we wrap up. First off, today was also the kickoff event for the Radau College of Humanities and Social Sciences 365 Days of Service and Learning, focused on housing insecurity issues over the next year. Keep an eye on the Radau College's website for more information on the programming and opportunities that will come about over the next year. Also, for those of you that were not among the 2 million plus Georgians that voted early, don't forget that tomorrow, November 8th, is Election Day. Polls will be open statewide from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., and it is a lengthy ballot. You can take a look at yours at the Georgia My Voter page and get out tomorrow to vote. Thanks to all three of our panelists for being here today. Look forward to seeing everybody for our next Campus to Community Forum, which will be in February, discussing community improvement districts. Hope everyone has a great day, and thanks for joining us.